This episode contains conversations surrounding opioid use, overdose, depression, suicidal thoughts. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to this season of Alter Eagle. We are starting season 1 with the topic of addiction in Butler County. Conversations on the physical side of addiction, trauma, the neuroscience, mental health, and stigma surrounding addiction. Experts, resources, and stories from people who have fought addiction head on. I am your host, Laura Krigo. Let's keep the conversation going. Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. For a long time, I suffered with depression and anxiety. I had tried therapy before, but struggled finding a therapist I connected with until I found BetterHelp. That's why I am so excited to share BetterHelp's mission to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, because finding a therapist can be hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online. Remote therapy sessions, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. Click the link in description and receive 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. And by clicking that link, you support this channel. Plus, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. I was struggling for a long time, and BetterHelp was where I found my therapist, Whitney, who I still see weekly for almost 2 years now. So, if you're struggling like I was, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in description or go to betterhelp.com/alter eagle. That's betterhelp.com/alter eagle. There's no better time than now to start your mental health journey. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. Yes, welcome. What's your middle name?
Anne.
Anne. Rachel Ann Shuster. I'm sitting here with Rachel today. So Rachel has many certifications and degrees here, so we're going to go through really quickly. I had to go through these with her. She's a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. She's a registered nurse. She's a certified addiction registered nurse and a certified allied addictions practitioner. And at the end of February, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're going to be inducted into at the end of February?
Yes. So I'm a member of the International Nursing Society on Addictions. And I, for a while, just really held myself back thinking, I haven't done enough to be a fellow of addictions nursing. So I had some colleagues encourage me, and I applied, and some lovely folks of mine wrote a letter of recommendation, and I was accepted. So I will be inducted into the International Academy of Addictions Nursing and in February at the INSA conference. So I'm really excited about that, and I'll be able to append those letters to the end of my rest of those initials come March.
I had to use the soundboard. That's just me. No, I think that the accomplishment of that just in itself, but for you and your story, we're really talking today about the stigma and the language and imagery behind addiction. Rachel is coming up on 12 years as a registered nurse. She's done critical care. She's obviously an addiction registered nurse as well. And just talking about re-engaging in therapy and how that was something that really helped you. That was one thing. Yes. But tell us a little bit about your history.
Yeah, so I'm here today to talk a little bit about my experience, not only as an addictions nurse, but also as a person in long-term recovery from opioid use disorder. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of my childhood, my upbringing, and what led to that substance use, because a lot of people, it's not a very traditional or stereotypical, I should say, pathway to start using substances problematically for the first time at age 25, right? By the time we get to that age, our brain and the the way that we can think about consequences and really rationalize like what we should do in a scenario is finally developed. But before that, that's why teens have a lot of risk-taking behaviors and whatnot. And I definitely had some of that, but I didn't have a chaotic relationship with substances until my mid-20s. And so going back to my family, I had a nuclear family, grew up with my mom, my dad, and my younger sister. I used to describe my childhood as relatively normal, and then someone, checked me on that and said, normal is subjective.
Yeah.
Normal's not like a thing. Normal's just a setting on the dryer.
Yeah.
And so, I realize now that like it was just what my perception of normal was. Like I have a normal childhood because I have whatever that's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
But being that, my dad he worked, he was the person who had the income and supported our family financially and, in many ways, but that was his main role. Right. Mm-hmm. And my mom was the homemaker and the child rearer. And because they had to make ends meet. They wanted more for us, like I think many people do with their kids.
Of course.
And so growing up, school was really important. Education was really important. Reading was really important. My dad is dyslexic. And so with his dyslexia, in those times, he was really shoved out of the classroom. And so he wasn't given the supports that exist today for people with different learning abilities. Mm-hmm. And so, that translated for him into a lot of things that my mom wanted to make sure that we could read, that we had those abilities, and that we had our resources that we needed to be able to do more, mm-hmm. To achieve more. And so that was really well ingrained into me as a child. And I think I learned how to get love and validation through positive attention. So sometimes you'll hear about like the bad kids, right? And things like that.
Yeah.
And it's every behavior is a form of communication. Every behavior. So you hear about acting out, and those children are just trying to communicate a need. Maybe they're not getting the attention that they need psychologically, and so they get the attention somehow. And I learned that I could get attention, get validation through achievement. When someone told me "good job," that rush, that was my first drug, right?
Of course, yeah,
and that really continued for me into college. Those high achieving values continued, but with I lived at I was on a residential campus. And so, with that distance from my parents, that freedom came some experimentation. In high school, there were times where I did try to get away with going to a party or, consuming alcohol, but it was very rare. My mom was very good at towing that line between, like how to keep your kids safe and still giving them that freedom. And she found out pretty much any time I tried to get away with something and was able to, abort the plan.
Yeah.
And so with college, I definitely experimented a lot more. I definitely binge drank and partook in college culture. I used cannabis a couple times. I could count like on one hand the amount of times I did. Mm-hmm. And there was 2 different times that I used someone else's Adderall prescription non-medically. And so, like pulling all-nighter, kind of studying or, driving home from Florida, 24-hour drive straight, spring break. So, those things existed, and that is substance misuse, but it wasn't addiction. And I like to make a point here that like substance use and substance use disorder are very different. They are not always one and the same.
Okay.
Many people use substances. Many people drink alcohol. Not everyone has an alcohol use disorder. Someone might smoke a cigarette here and there, but they don't have a nicotine use disorder or nicotine dependency. And so, yes, it does kind of get into semantics a little bit, but it's really important to make that distinction, because I think sometimes when we see someone use a substance and they had took it too far, you drank too much, you had X, Y, Z, then we say, well, you have a problem. Yeah. You're the problem. And that's not always necessarily the case. And so it's important to make the distinction between like there are very specific criteria for a substance use disorder. And when you give someone that label sticks around. It sticks around their medical charts. It sticks around. So we want to be very careful. We don't just dole out diagnoses and dole out those labels. So anywho, off my soapbox and back to me, as it should be. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, that is why we're here. So
awkward. I love talking about myself and hate it both at the same time.
Everyone who's come on is like, I don't like talking about myself. I'm like, well, that's what I need you to do.
Yes,
so
I enjoy it. It's an important message, and I enjoy it. I think storytelling is such a really vital tool in the behavioral health space, and underutilized underutilized in non-traditional environments, right? You go to a 12-step meeting, that's what you do. You tell your story. Yeah. You share your experiences. There's healing in that. And I think that we need to tell more stories and get more vulnerable.
Absolutely.
But I ended up graduating college. At the time, I had started dating my now husband. I started working my first job. I was set. I went to nursing school to be a critical care nurse. That was my intention. It really formulated from a lot of plans of wanting to be a certified registered nurse anesthetist. And then I did some job shadowing and felt like this is just not my bag. Came to find out years later that I have a sleep-wake disorder. And so it's not really an environment like sitting in an OR wasn't going to be my bag. And I also really loved working with patients, having conversations. And so I didn't want my patient to be asleep. And now a lot of times they are in the ICU, but you've got families, you've got a lot of that healing and therapeutic connections to make. And so I loved working in the ICU. It was where I wanted to go. So I started my career at Forbes in Monroeville and worked in the trauma, medical, neuro ICU. They were just starting then to get their trauma certification, and worked there for a little over a year, ended up getting engaged, bought a house, we got a dog, got married, you know, all these things that were just like check on the what's next. Because I was always go. I was always hyper involved in high school and in college. I just felt like it was like what I needed to do, right? Like it was what you did to be the best, and I needed to be the best. And, you know, going into some of that with my mental health is really important as well, because I think I was so busy that I didn't give myself time to feel feelings. And so here, after I finally checked off everything I'm supposed to do on my list, and now all I have on my plate is go to work, come home, live your life, I didn't know how to transition into adulthood. I wasn't really well equipped for understanding like, oh, I can still get involved in like my community.
Yeah,
you
right.
know? Like I just didn't, there was this gap, right? Where I felt like, what is next? And it left me with this feeling of discontent. And I was also really struggling with like my mental health, but didn't recognize it yet. Yeah. I knew I felt off, but I couldn't say this must be major depressive disorder. This must be generalized anxiety disorder, right? Like I didn't have words to put to it. So after a while, you know, I'm working in the ICU, and I start kind of doing things, and I can make sense of this now looking back. I can't really make sense of it if I am, you know, in that moment. So don't mistake it as like I was making these conscious choices. Yeah. It's just looking back, it gives you that, you know, hindsight's 20/20.
Yes.
And so when I look back and kind of realize like I was starting to chase what I joke as my original drug of choice, right? I was starting to chase the achievement. I ended up enrolling in nursing school again to go for my master's degree. I wanted to be a family nurse practitioner. And so I was doing that, and then also working full-time in the ICU and working part-time at PC3 as a nursing instructor. And what does that do? Already my mental health was suffering, and now I just loaded myself up with way too many things, zero time for self-care. Self-care gets thrown around a lot, right? We often see, you know, self-care is important, you know, here, have a little mini back rub at work, or, or here's your pizza party, you know, and like go take a bubble bath. Sometimes self-care is the hard stuff. Yeah. Sometimes self-care is going to therapy. Sometimes self-care is, you know, going and doing that workout you don't want to do. Like self-care is a lot more broad than just the spa day, you know?
Yeah.
And so here I didn't have any time to take care of myself, and I was already starting to experience depression, anxiety. So it really set myself up for, being in a place where I was discontent and I was going to end up looking for some sort of an out. And I was uncomfortable with like this slower paced work lifestyle too. I wanted more achievement. And here now in the real world, I'm not just being compared to my academic cohort. I'm not just being compared to class of 2000, whatever. I'm being compared to people who could be my parents, my grandparents. And I didn't know how to stand out still against that many folks, how to stand out in my world.
Wow.
Because, in high school, you were kind of in college too. You're being measured academically. And in the real world, I wasn't, it's like I couldn't get that feedback almost, that feedback loop of I need to get an A. Like, oh, well, I could get a good performance review at work, but like most people do. So like, unless you're like a really terrible employer, you're struggling with something. And so like, it just I wasn't getting that advancement that I desired. And on top of that, a really, really important part of my story is horizontal violence, which is a major issue in nursing. And it
so what? Yeah, you're gonna tell us what that is.
I'm gonna. That's
She's gonna tell us.
Let's
Sorry,
do it.
I was like, what is that?
What is horizontal violence?
I'm like,
let me tell you. So, horizontal violence is a fancy way of just saying bullying. And when we say horizontal, we really mean like on a coworker level, right? It's not a hierarchy. It's not a manager. It is your peers, horizontal violence. And so it's definitely problematic, especially in environments that attract strong personalities.
Yep.
ICU, emergency department, your flight nurses, all of that. And so I initially, was really trying to navigate that. I ended up kind of in the middle of a conflict on my unit and picking sides. And for a while, I was sucked into all that drama. But the moment that I decided that wasn't me anymore and I wasn't going to fall into that mess, I got a target on my back. And there were very real things that this individual did. But those very real things that they did made me extremely paranoid that they had the capacity to set me up, even if that meant hurting my patients. And that was a very real fear. And, it's so much so that like one example, and it was always things that you just couldn't necessarily prove, And so like one example was I had a patient who had alcohol use disorder and was going through DTs, or what we call delirium tremens, which when alcohol withdrawal is very severe and causes psychosis. And oftentimes patients may need to be in the ICU, restrained, sedated, intubated on the breathing machine. And we have to keep withdrawals at bay with lorazepam, commonly known as Ativan. And we have scheduled doses that we're giving intravenously to try to help keep the person comfortable. And we do this based on a scale, we see where they're at, but then there's these scheduled doses too. And it is an unspoken rule that if you have a medication that's scheduled during a shift change, like 7 p.m., that's when I start my shift, but you're giving me report from 7 to 7:30. So by the time report is done and I'm just settling in, that medication is due and needs given. So it is common courtesy if that is scheduled at 1900 or at 7 o'clock, the offgoing shift gives it.
Let's do military time. I like that.
I like military time.
I have military time on my phone. So
I feel like we do so many back through things in the United States, like intros and,
But when you said that, I was like, I know what that is.
I know 1900.
Oh, no, sorry. I didn't mean to like go off, but
no,
yes.
That's okay. But so it was those things. And I had a terrible shift after that, right? I got kicked in the stomach by the patient because they're uncomfortable and they don't know what they're doing. They're not trying to be erratic. It's just a biological process. But anywho, full circle, that this person, made me feel unsafe. I was not safe at work. And so like I was signing up all the time to be down-staffed, if census was low, if we didn't have enough patients, like, please, yeah, I'll take the night off. I don't need the money. Like, just let me stay at home. I would avoid working certain shifts. And I mean, it was just really, I don't know the word I'm even looking for. It was just, it had so much control over me.
Yeah.
And I would go to my manager. I didn't really have the assertiveness that I do now to be able to like go up the chain. Like, I don't have that fear now. I did then. And so I kept going to my manager and didn't feel like I could go to HR, that I could go up the chain. I didn't understand because I was pretty fresh still, right? Here I am in my early 20s.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, 24, 25.
And it's, again, this is the hindsight is 2020, right? Being in a situation like that and realizing that, and we talked about this a little bit, the way that person is treating you has nothing to do with you, but you are essentially the punching bag. You are the one that they've just, for whatever reason, and you start to beat yourself up and you're like, why is this person not relenting? And even when you have those conversations, did you feel, because I can relate to this situation. You feel like you're having the conversation with your manager, you're doing the right thing, and it's going to get itself sorted out. And then the next interaction, it's like, it's almost worse, right? It just feels like it just keeps getting worse.
Yes. And the doors had, her manager's door wasn't a solid door, had a little window. And so people could walk by, they see you in the manager's office. And I remember one time, one of the nurses from the other unit walked past. And then when I came out and went back to my unit, they said, don't go over to the medical ICU. They're talking about you over there. That kills you. That kills you as a young something. And these people could be my parents. I went to school with their children. Like, I went to high school with their children. And so I just felt so psychologically unsafe. And, here I am experiencing that. Oh, yeah. And then they called me a narc. That was fun. So, it's the name calling, it's the labeling, it's so hurtful. And, whoever said like sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Wrong. So wrong. Words hurt. Words matter. Words can be really painful. And do I know? Because it is my weapon of choice. If I'm going to hurt you, my sharp tongue comes out. And so I really am still baffled by that behavior. And I often am I'm getting a little worked up right now, and I don't know why, but I think it's because I'm letting that shield down a little more than I ever have. I've always talking about it so objectively, but I remember running into my bully and I was, into recovery by this time, and I ran into her at Dairy Queen. I was just standing there thinking, show her you're okay. Because, during once I ended up using substances, and I'll rewind a little bit to get into that more, but I want to make a point. But once I started using substances and ended up, like, I started to think, like, you're going to let her win. You're letting her win. She has all this. And of course, when everything went down, which I'll get into as well, I can't imagine how good she must have felt. Which is like so yucky, but I don't know. Hope she listens to this. If you're out there, too. Call me.
See, what's hard about that is, and tell me if I'm wrong, whenever that happens, you want to be able to talk to them. Did you ever want that? Where you could just stand up to them, but not be as hurtful as they were being to you. And just sort like, almost like, listen, like, I'm done.
I just wanted to work.
You're like, I just want to come to work. I want to work. And here's the thing. When you're young like that, right? It's almost like people are holding it against you that you're young. You're like, well, I can't help when I was born. Like, it's not my fault that I am, but you used to be here. And shouldn't you be approaching this situation in a manner of like mentoring, like being supportive and if I do something wrong, not that someone can't be a little like abrasive or harsh but recognizing that, because I've done that. Trust me. I've said something and I'm like, that wasn't how I wanted that to come out. That came off a little too harsh. And I've tried, and maybe there were certain times in my life where I wasn't so good at it, but now I'm in a place where I'm like, I'm sorry. That is not how I meant that. Like, you're doing an amazing job. But I think I just get particular sometimes about things, and that's my reaction. So I let them know, like, hey, that's just me. I'm just so particular. That's all that was. I realize I said that a little bit harsher than I should have because I do care if I hurt someone's feelings.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes it comes down to that, right?
Yeah.
And you're obviously that person too.
I feel heavily. I feel like I don't know. I think it's oftentimes like one of the commonalities, not totally, but I think a lot of people who have dealt with a substance use disorder or a process addiction are super feelers.
Yeah.
You know, because I think if we're feeling things, then we want to numb things, because there's comfortable emotions, enjoyable emotions, and then there's ones that are not comfortable to sit with. And then, that's right back to where I was. I was uncomfortable. I'm getting bullied at work. I'm way too busy. I'm not taking care of myself. I feel like I'm not getting any recognition, things like that. And so, people ask me why that first time, because it's kind of bizarre. You hear a lot of stories about the opioid epidemic and how, the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma and all of that. And those are very real parts of this, of the story, but it's not everyone's. And so sometimes it feels weird for me to say, like, I went straight to the needle. I didn't have an escalation. I didn't have that, start with something else. I just saw this medication makes my patients feel good. I don't know, maybe it'll make me feel good too. I know the doses, I know the side effects. I can use my sterile supplies in the hospital once and dispose of my sharps in the sharps container. And, just really felt like I wasn't hurting anyone. And just figured, like, instead of asking myself, why would I do this? It was just like, why not?
I'm Joe Mahoney, Executive Director at the Ellen O'Brien Geyser Center. And it's time for another mental health light bulb moment. Did you know that 1/4 of people experiencing a substance use disorder will also experience a mental health diagnosis? This number is actually thought to be higher due to people not accurately reporting symptoms or seeking help.
I wasn't in a place where I was mentally healthy, and mental health is a really important protective factor.
Yes.
Right. So, and that's where, as I maintain my recovery today, mental health is my focus, not a drug or my relationship with it. It is mental health, because if I am in a place where my mental health is balanced and stable, I have more resiliency. I can access coping mechanisms that would not otherwise be able to be accessed if I was activated in a certain different way,
Yeah.
So, it's really important for me to maintain that mental health, because for me, when they say, like, why that first time, mental health was a big part, but I just felt like all the stars aligned. And I think, like, even in the nursing world, like, I saw that when I did my psych rotation too, right? So here I'm in my psychiatric and mental health nursing class, and we do our rotations on psych units and things like that. And I remember one of the patients on the unit was a nurse, and I was just blown away by the fact that, like, someone in a career that I'm working towards could end up here. And these these things happen whenever we go through a crisis and don't have the necessary supports to make it through.
Yes.
So we find different solutions. We find what we think are solutions,
Self-medicated, that's how, a lot of this topic, right, is that's how people become alcoholics and drug addicts, because we are self-medicating. We're like, well, this thing makes me feel good. It makes me happy. It takes away all of that. It's almost noise, right? Sometimes. Then there's that chemical side of it with the neuroscience, that I've talked to Dr. Brophy and Joe Mahoney about. And I feel like I bring them up in every episode, but it's true. It's this, depending on what what's going on up here, all it takes is for that one thing and the one time, and then that's it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because then it's like, after that, you can't function without it. You can't move forward. Like, there are functioning alcoholics. There are functioning, right?
Most are. you know?
Yeah.
Most people with a substance use disorder are using the substance so that they can function.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's what a lot of people who don't have the substance abuse, and I feel like there are more than not, and they're just not, they just don't think it's a problem, right? Because they're able to go out and live their life, and maybe they're lucky in that sense. And I shouldn't even say lucky, because that's not, I don't think that that's a word that should be used in this. So I'm going to take that back. I'm going to take that back. And that's something I'm learning with this, is just being sensitive to
privilege. It's privilege.
It is, right? That they don't have a DUI and they haven't spent time in jail, and they didn't experience what you experienced, you know?
Privilege is a big part of my story as well, and why I am able to be where I am today. I had a lot of resources afforded to me that many people don't. I am a white, well-appearing woman, you know.
You're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, which
I am.
gorgeous.
Thanks.
The first time we were supposed to meet, she like did her hair all up, and my schedule was crazy. And I'm like, "Can we Zoom?" And she's like, "She did her hair so pretty." And I was like, "Well, it looks gorgeous. I see it on Zoom. Sorry."
It's like a rarity when I have to like get put together, because I work from home. So
of course,
if I don't need to be on camera, I'm not going on camera.
Yeah, you're like, don't need to do it.
I'll brush my teeth when I am done waking up and after my coffee.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yes. Isn't that a fun thing, right?
Yes.
And then you get to like lunch and you're like, huh. Yeah, I got to brush my teeth. Yeah. I should, just for myself and my overall. Yeah. There's a little bit of, stuff.
Yes.
But just we got off subject there.
That's
and
okay.
lost where we were going. I don't want to get you off, but
we were going with my first use. And so that first time that I used, I felt like, whoa, this is what I'm supposed to feel like. Is this what other people feel like all the time? Like normal? I felt like I could be a super nurse, super wife, super friend, super daughter, whatever. Like I got a sense of calm. I had a sense of, this is what I need to get these uncomfortable feelings out of the way. These uncomfortable feelings, and I don't say bad or good, because they're inanimate objects. Feelings, they're not good. They're not bad. Same as drugs. They're not good. They're not bad. They just live. They just are, know? And so I got those uncomfortable emotions out of the way and felt like, now I can take on all these things that I need to be taking on. Now I was back to this high achiever that I thought that I needed to be.
Wow.
And so, when we talk about drug use, that first time, yes, I made a choice. I made a choice that time. But then because of that choice, my brain said, you know what? That's what you need to get through life. This is a solution. Like you can you can handle this. You're different. You can, just make sure you moderate your use, right? And so for me, that psychological desire really began to feel like a need for me. My story is unique because my point of access to substances was a medical setting, and it was my work environment. And so I was limited to my shifts, right? And so because I worked 3 12-hour shifts, sometimes I would stack my shifts together and like work Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then have this like fake week off in between.
Yeah.
And that would allow me to do, the clinicals, the school stuff, all of that. And because of that, I never developed a physical dependency, maybe mild, but I never had like a physical withdrawal. Right?
Okay.
But I definitely had a rapidly increasing tolerance. So it was more and more needed to achieve that same effect. And this is classic for a substance use disorder, that classic progression, the worsening obsessions and compulsions. I was using in riskier places, at riskier times, and riskier ways. And I was even at times when I couldn't access my drug of choice, which was fentanyl, I would use other things. And so I have to kind of say, if you're listening to this and you don't have a medical background or have not been exposed to that through people that in a medical setting, pharmaceutical companies dose medications in vials if they're liquid, right? And in these vials or ampules, you sometimes have more medication than you need. for example, let's say if we're talking about fentanyl, an ampule of fentanyl might be 100 micrograms. And so a dose that's ordered might be 25 or 50 micrograms that you're administering to that patient. And so the other remaining medication in that vial does not get saved for later. You can't, you can't
use it for someone else.
You can't use it for someone else. It is a single-use vial, and it is called a waste. You have to waste it. And so what happens when you waste is that there are always supposed to be 2 individuals for accountability. And that is a rule. That's what's supposed to happen. In practice, it does not always happen. In practice, sometimes you're rushing to the bedside to get that medication and you're, popping vials open, things are flying.
Yeah.
And so then you're, wasting the medication after the fact. There's breaks in that chain in reality, because it's just, people are spread thin and you're trying to just do your best.
Yeah.
And there's also a sense of trust within nursing. Yes, we eat our own, we eat our young, and sometimes the young eat the old, and, it's like that, but there's also camaraderie and this sense of unity, and we're stronger together and we protect our own. And so we trust one another. We don't think that and then stigma plays into this, right? Stigma plays into this in a way that is so unique as well, because I could use stigma to my advantage because I didn't look like someone they would suspect, because I didn't act like someone they would suspect, because I was being helpful and hardworking, and I was always willing to, you need me to go do something for your patient? Sure. Yeah, no problem. I'll help you bathe your patient. I'll help you pass your meds, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, it wasn't stigma or biases, I should say. Biases played into it, because stigma comes out of biases. Stigma comes out of that prejudice, that stereotype. And so it's really our cognitive distortions that kind of allowed that to occur as well. But so as you continue to use, and I'm sure Dr. Brophy talked about this, it changes our brain's reward pathways. And so we have endogenous morphine, endorphins.
Yes.
Right? So we have endorphins in our body. The endorphins act like morphine. That's where the runner's high comes from, right? And so when we take an external source of dopamine, right? So this medication, the way it works, it causes a surge, a rush of dopamine. And so when our body gets that and says, oh, I got this from an external source, I guess I don't need to make as much of my own now. That is really where addiction comes from. And kind of this malaise, or I should say, I'm speaking specifically to opioids at this point, but when you take away that substance, now the body's not making its own. So when you hear about someone who maybe has a prolonged withdrawal syndrome or a post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or called PAWS, P-A-W-S.
Okay.
Sometimes that can last up to a year, 2 years. And that's really challenging, because what is someone likely to do if they're feeling awful? They're going to want to try to replace that dopamine, so then they return to use, right?
Yes.
And that's why the cycle is so challenging to break. Because, we do have chemical changes, and that's where the disease model rises out of. Where I sit with all that, I think that I like the disease model for certain parts of it. I think it helps to normalize it in some ways, and also it gives people disability rights protections.
Yeah.
Because the ADA does, not during active use, but in remission, someone is protected under the ADA, and, it's considered a disability.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's really important to, make sure you don't keep your employees from, making a meeting they need to, or things like that. Making sure they can have those workplace accommodations to maintain their wellness, right?
Yes.
That's where that comes from.
Okay.
But I really don't see it as something that is, it's really biopsychosocial. There's just too much. Genetics are 50%, but they're not a be-all, end-all. Just because you've got genetics doesn't mean anything. You have twin studies everywhere.
Yeah, that was something he talked about a lot too, is how you can literally have twins, and one of them can, have this chemical dependency, right?
Yes.
On using, and then the other one, it never happens.
Yes.
And they're figuring that out, right? And how it's how is that possible? And it's almost like this their minds were blown when they're realizing this, and they're like, okay, this is something we need to really look into and understand more. And that's why it is that sort of like, you know, with the brain and how our brains are, you know, even though they're like built the same,
right?
They are very different.
They are, right? Like we're all a little neurosparkly. I like to say, you know, like what is neurotypical?
I like that. Neurosparkly.
Aren't we all neurodiverse?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I just, even thinking like me and my sister, right? We both grew up in the same household with the same set of parents, but we both had different experiences. She had hers, I had mine. And you have to think like we as humans, we try to categorize things to make sense of the world, to help us to remain safe and survive as a species. But it sometimes causes us to be overly reductive about a situation. Like, how could that happen? Look, the rest of the siblings were fine, and why did she do that? Well, we also have very individual experiences. I can tell you that, you know, my sister wasn't around with every person I dated. My sister wasn't around in all of my friendships. My sister didn't see things that I experienced.
Yes.
And so I also had 2 years of life before she existed. So, you know, there are very real things that happen in people's lives, and their experiences shape their perception of reality, and then our coping mechanisms, you know, help us deal with that reality.
Of course.
So it started to progress for me, kind of getting back to my story some, because I will definitely get on plenty of tangents. If you let me step up on the soapbox, I'm ready. But yeah, so it became kind of over a while, you know, it was a solution. I found the drug helpful for me for a period of time. And then I started to feel like these conflicting personalities. So what I know of it now, it was my value system. The behaviors that I was doing did not align with my values. I valued honesty. I valued not stealing. I valued not being sneaky. And I valued not being dishonest to my family and trying to hide things. I liked transparency. And so I really felt like that was in a direct conflict. And I was also starting to get worried, like I'm going to get caught, like things are going to blow up in my face. Like I got to stop this. And there were many points in my very short period of time. This is about a 9-month journey for me. So my experience with using fentanyl was short-lived. But I lived it. It was long enough. But I got a bracelet this one time because, you know, I started to recognize mental health was kind of a part of my journey. I was trying out some therapy here and there, but I didn't know much about therapy at that point. I didn't recognize that it's kind of like dating. Sometimes you got to shop around. Sometimes you get a few duds. Sometimes you just have someone who isn't the right fit. Yes. Come on. We all know. Don't we? And so, you know,
it's going to drink some more water.
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily always mean that the person's a bad therapist. It's just like, you know, me and you aren't meshing.
Yeah. And that can be one of the hardest things with therapy is a lot of times it can set people off that track. They're like, this isn't going to work for me. This isn't what I need to be doing, because I went through that. So yes, we did talk about that.
Especially when it's already, it's a higher barrier thing. It's less of a quick fix.
Yes.
And society, we all want quick fixes. We're so busy. We just are trying to get things to fit in our lives. And so, you know, like, I've got to be a mom. I've got to be at this. I got to do this. I wear all these hats. I've got to be at this place. And so I can't deal with this pain. I can't deal with this feeling, you know? I think that plays a lot into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're talking about that, you know, endless cycle, I notice you have that just once more.
Yes. So here I am, and it's just, I don't want to do this anymore. I bought myself a bracelet that I was saying that said, "Be brave." It had a little green triangle on it. And I thought, I'll look down at that when I go to use, right? I was injecting mostly in my arms or in my muscles. I was muscling. And so I would look down, I would see it, and I thought I could willpower through it. Like, I can be strong. And it had nothing to do with it. So here I am, you know, like, thinking that I was, you know, stronger. And then here are these that I thought I could be stronger. So then that misconception of mine led me to thinking I'm weak. right? Like if I can't do this, then I'm the problem. So it was always this, all right, I just got a cold turkey. Like, this is it. Just once more. This is going to be the last time. This is the last time. You better enjoy it. Okay, that was it. That was the last time. But any time the opportunity presented itself again, that psychological desire, it's incredibly difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced that. But think about your own vices and how hard it is to say no to things at sometimes and then just amplify it. You know, like imagine you're in a room and you're just so thirsty and all of a sudden a glass of water presents itself. It's reductive, but it was extremely challenging to feel that way and to feel like I'm broken. Couple months into my substance use, my family found out. I had tried to seek out substances on the streets instead of the medical setting because I thought, and I didn't know, I was so naive. I thought I could buy a pill and use pill identifiers to know what it was and then to be able to know the dose I was taking and that I could still, you know, be safer that way. I didn't know then about counterfeit pills. I didn't know then about pill presses. I didn't know that you could basically make anything into anything. And so, you know, it would have been a big risk for me. Luckily, the individual that I had outreach to told a family member of hers, and that family member told my mom. So we did not go through with it. And I'm glad because I think that would have opened up a lot of doors for me. I talk in my story about the doors that I've kept closed. And those are protective factors for me to keep those doors closed. The fact that I don't know where to source a substance, like, yeah, I could figure it out. But there are doors that I like to keep closed. And that's one for me. And I know because I've opened the door of diverting from a medical setting, there's certain environments that I don't want to work in anymore. That was hard for me to accept for a while. Like I just thought, here I'm supposed to be an ICU nurse my whole life. Why did I want to be an ICU nurse? Well, I told you it was about the nurse anesthetist thing, but another part of that was this perfectionism and wanting to be the best. And I thought that critical care nursing, because they were the sickest patients, was the best nursing. And so it's so bizarre. Like what a skewed perspective. But yeah, I ended up going to, you know, my parents, they were livid. My husband was devastated. He was, you know, dealing with this with me too. And it was just a whole experience. And at that point I knew I was kind of like, I was a tornado and I was trying to get people out of my path. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I just wanted them to not be in my path. Don't keep me from where I'm going to go. If you try to keep me from where I'm going to go, you're going to get hurt. I don't want to hurt you.
Wow.
Like, and it's almost that's what the behavior is communicating. But often we perceive it as, you know, you're manipulative. You steal off me. You're deceitful and just awful. You know, like all of those words that we use to describe people. Who might engage in certain behaviors surrounding their substance use.
Having close family members discover something like that, and obviously they immediately go to this place of like, this is devastating. This is the worst thing ever, right? And that's projected onto you.
Yes. Yeah.
So then you can, regardless of where you are in your substance abuse, it's like you can feel that's sort of what's emanating from them. It's like a desperation, right?
Yeah, because they know they don't want their loved one to be hurting. They don't want their loved one to be unwell.
Yeah.
And so we have people that oftentimes they like want the same thing, but we're arguing about how to get there.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
You have the person who is in the throes of it saying like, you can't take this thing away from me. I need this thing right now. And then you've got the other side being like, you need to quit cold turkey, go to treatment, throw you into detox, you know, like, and also like this misconception that like treatment is like this like be all end all fix all thing. Yeah. And it's not.
No.
And sometimes treatment can further someone's trauma. Right. Because there's improvements to be made in that realm. And there is sometimes high turnover. So you've got staff sometimes who aren't using culturally competent language and they're not being trauma informed. And again, these are big buzzwords, right?
Yeah.
But they're more than just saying we're trauma informed. It's not about going to a class. It's about knowing that maybe you don't want to approach someone from behind because they have had an experience that, you know, makes them a little jumpy. Maybe we're careful to not have like big, loud banging noises or like, you know, taking people to like go see fireworks on the 4th of July or something. Like maybe someone has had an experience where that is traumatizing. And so like we have to understand like everyone brings different experiences to the table that requires us to provide really specific individualized care that meets people where they're at.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things Alyssa had said on her episode was talking about when someone first comes into treatment, it's not, you don't sit down with them and say, okay, tell me about your trauma. Tell me about all the bad things that have happened about you. That's not what you,
never.
Because one of the biggest things when someone's going into recovery is they need to be able to trust you, right?
Yes.
You, like when you went into that and you're talking to a therapist, you need to know that you can trust this person.
Yes.
They'll say like, oh, with therapy, right? I go to therapy and well, we sign these waivers and we can't talk about what you say unless you're going to self-harm or harm someone else. That's the only time they're ever allowed to alert anyone, right? But in your head, you're thinking, but I've had people say that to me before and they have gone out and told other people and they have talked about me behind my back.
I also worry about perception. I talked a little bit how I was kind of becoming these like two personalities. I kind of felt like this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, like there was two sides of me and they didn't align. I didn't like that I was stealing. I didn't like that I was lying and manipulating. I had marks and bruises on my legs and arms and made a lot of excuses about that. Because I was using such high amounts of fluid. I wasn't using like a small insulin needle, like is most often used when injecting most of the time, you know, like I was using larger needles. And so I, with larger amounts of fluid in them. And so I had a lot of marks and bruises, and this affected my relationship with my husband. I think it's really important we talk about this because people don't like to bring up the awkward stuff, and sexual intimacy is the awkward stuff, but it's a really important facet of our overall well-being, our holistic health. And so because I didn't want my husband to see this evidence of my use on my body, I didn't want to be intimate with him. And so for him, that felt like she doesn't love me, right? He didn't know that that's why I was hiding it, because I had to keep that veil over. But that really, really affected us because I didn't want I didn't want anyone to know, right?
Yeah.
And so I continued to use, because what helps more to make those uncomfortable feelings go away, but more using, right? And so I also sought out more opportunities for recognition and achievement, because who would suspect this hardworking, helpful nurse? It was one point in March of 2016, I had an incident in the hospital because I had used a different substance that caused me to basically have like a blackout experience. So I was like awake and functioning, but I only know like what I had done during that time because of what my coworkers had shared with me about my behaviors. I had used a benzodiazepine intravenously. And so because of like the culture that night, what ended up happening, they covered my patients. They tried to get into my phone to call my husband, but, passcodes and all of that. And I wouldn't let them in, I guess. And they kind of like hold me up in a room. I don't know. But I remember in the morning, I was like kind of sort of coming back to it. And I remember my manager came in and took me down to the emergency department. Of course, they did a drug screen, but drug screens are faulty too. And so, it didn't show up on there. Wow. And so like the whole hospitalization, they rolled my diagnoses as fatigue and just basically overworking myself, because why not? Didn't all the evidence point to that? Didn't all the evidence point to she's working 2 jobs plus going to school? And, like it just, it was too easy to believe. You didn't want to believe that it was what it was.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm sure they were scared, thinking, okay, all signs are kind of pointing this way,
yes,
but they're also pointing this way too.
Right.
This is also a possibility. And maybe there was like this relief on their part. And that's, the weird thing about that is that's something that like they cared, that there were probably people in that situation that did really care, right?
Yeah.
That were like,
and like, it's no one's fault. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
It was my behaviors, and I can own that. I I still wish to this day that like I had a non-awkward opportunity to speak to a lot of my old coworkers.
Yeah.
To apologize.
Maybe this is.
Yeah, maybe. I am sorry.
I'm sorry that I don't have my tissues. Do I need to go grab tissues?
No,
for you?
I'm good.
I
just
should have them. I'm getting the tissues.
I can't imagine the confusion that they felt seeing me go through that, and probably wanting to help, and seeing maybe their loved ones in me too, right? Like who knows what experiences they brought to the table. And so I just wish I could apologize to people, especially Stephanie, because she was there on the night that I overdosed, and I think she found me. I just wish I could apologize to her specifically. Maybe someday in person. But it is hard. It's hard because you do carry this, right? Like I carry myself with the confidence that you wouldn't know that these are feelings that I carry around.
Of course.
But I feel awful for what I put them through and what they must have had to do to cope in the coming days. Just all the confusion and like the why would she do that? And just,
of course.
It's been really hard and traumatic. I mean, to see me. So getting into my overdose, since we're kind of talking about that.
Yeah, since we're there, let's.
So where my substance use chaos ended and where my recovery began was on July 15th of 2016. And my recovery date is July 16th of 2016. And what that means for me is I have not had a problematic relationship with opioids, and I've been in long-term sustained remission from opioid use disorder since that date. Got my big sniffle there.
Girl, it's all good.
And so I was on a second night shift of 6 in a row, and I was getting report from the daylight nurse who had one of my patients who was having some respiratory issues. And they were previously on the ventilator, or like, they were intubated, right, on the breathing machine, and we're on a BiPAP. But as we were, which is another kind of machine that forces air in to help keep your lungs inflated and help oxygenate. And so while the individual was giving me a report, we noticed there, some alarms starting to go off in the patient's room. And so when we went in and, made sure that, treat the patient, not the monitor, right? Make sure all the monitors are on and working, assess the patient. She was having some difficulties respiratory wise. And so I ended up grabbing like the ambu bag where you're like pressing it and, pushing in air. And I was giving mechanical ventilation that way. And, we had the respiratory therapist came, they started a breathing treatment. But when I auscultated or listened with my stethoscope on the lungs, the individual was not moving air. So I felt like there was an obstruction somewhere. And so we had this short exchange, this argument back and forth, a disagreement about what we should do clinically. He's like, she needs a breathing treatment. I'm like, the medication, it's just going to stay in her mouth. She's not getting it into her lungs, And so 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity, pass as we're still, working and trying to help. And the respiratory arrest progressed to a cardiac arrest. So lack of the oxygenation, too much stress on the body, then she arrested. So we did a full code and everything. And when someone, got her back on the breathing machine and got her back and stabilized. And when someone is on, you're breathing through a tube is very uncomfortable, right? So we have to sedate people to help them to be comfortable and to heal. And oftentimes these are medications like opioids, benzodiazepines, other sedatives like that. And so what the protocol was at that time, along with some other as-needed medications, we did a fentanyl drip. So the pharmacy would send up a IV bag of fentanyl, pre-mixed, and, you hook it up, set it at rates, and base it off weight and everything, and then you're set and good to go. So when the bag came up from pharmacy, I went to hang that for the patient, and the bag from before was still there. It was still hanging. And that was kind of bizarre. It's bizarre to leave a controlled substance just like out and not in use, unless they maybe suspected that, the individual would need it again. But it was a couple of days old. And so I had learned retrospectively that the hospital was starting to watch me. They were gathering evidence because you they'll let you do that to try to make a case, because otherwise, if they don't have the evidence, it's just hearsay.
Yeah.
And so anyhow, I saw that bag and my mind was just like, jackpot, right? So this is all serendipitous. I'm grateful it happened this way. I'm grateful I'm grateful now knowing, because I think it would have been a lot more painful to have been found out after all that evidence and everything was gathered. Like this decided and started that process for me, and was also really momentous for me. Like it shook me to my core, and I think I needed that a little bit to arrest my own substance use. And so anywho, I ended up taking that half IV bag and wasted what was not that medication. Lots of ideas if we have any creative inventors out there, or people who want to do patent work and stuff, because I've got some ideas for how to help prevent diversion in medical settings. Like, why do we make drugs that look just like water and saline? Surely there's some sort of body safe coloring or something we could, to prevent that, or even have like an AccuDose sort of machine that just dispenses the exact amount of medication as ordered for the patient into a pre-dose syringe that you just walk to the room and give, so you don't have a waste. There's all these things, but that's what I did. I wasted water.
She said it first. So if anyone out there tries to take this idea and run with it, this is dated.
Yeah.
Today's date is Monday, January 15th. That's not when this is going to air. So okay, you're welcome.
Thank
and
you.
continue.
Thank you. And I'd love to work with you, because I just don't have the capital. So let's just put our minds together.
Hey, if you're interested, contact a Butler Eagle, Butler, Pennsylvania. We'll get you her contact information. Okay.
So I ended up taking that bag of fentanyl. I went to the bathroom. I started an IV in my own arm. I hooked up IV tubing and I started to let it infuse in. I used what I thought I wanted. I looked at what was left and thought, that's not going to be enough for later. I might as well use it now, and continue to let it infuse. Shortly thereafter, the last thing I remember is kind of losing my balance and taking one step back. And I don't recall anything else. I don't know how I fell, what position I was in relative to the door. Luckily, the staff bathrooms, they were on a timed lock. So if there was no motion inside after a period of time, it would unlock. And so they were luckily able to get in. But it wasn't until about 2 hours later that they found me. And I find this as a really pivotal reason that I do the work I do, because I don't know why I was given the chance that so many others are not given. And I think it's because I am supposed to channel my experiences to make this world a better place, better than I found it. Because it doesn't make sense that I was down that long. When someone is pushing the plunger of a syringe and overdoses on an opioid, they stop pushing that plunger because they fall out, right? But because I had hooked up IV tubing, when I went down, the rest of that bag continued to go into my body. And it wasn't until 2 hours later, it doesn't make sense that I don't have cognitive brain damage, whatever, anoxic brain injury from not getting enough oxygen. It doesn't make sense that I survived. But they found me about 2 hours later and administered naloxone, or Narcan, better known as Narcan, the opioid overdose reversal agent. I talk about this a little bit because a few years back, there was a lot of misinformation around Narcan parties and people using as much as possible to get as quote unquote high as possible. And there's just so much myth in that. No person who has an opioid use disorder wants to be given Narcan. Remember, circling back, how I said I didn't really feel like I had a lot of physical dependency because I didn't have withdrawal when I didn't have an opioid in my system? This is the closest thing I could tell you I felt to what withdrawal must feel like. If you had given me a saw at that point, I might have tried to saw my legs off at the shins because my ankles hurt so bad. Maybe the way I fell, maybe the weight of my shoes. I had Dansko, big clog shoes.
Yeah.
Maybe, but all of my bones hurt. I remember all my bones hurt. I was hot, but I was also cold. I was shivering. I was sweating. I threw up immediately, so I'd vomit all through my hair and just everything. I just remember feeling so terrible. And the first thought when I woke up was, why didn't they just let me die? Oh, God, it's all over now. And I just thought, this is it. You know, my fellow nurses, because who responds to codes when codes are paged overhead in the hospital where I was at? It's the ICU nurses. So my peers frowned me. And I remember seeing like the fluorescent lights go overhead, like they were wheeling me down the hallway. And my charge nurse saying, "What did you take? Rachel, what did you take?" And being like, I want to tell her because I know like information wise, this is something she needs to know, but like, I don't want to admit it because there could be ramifications. And there is always there's that conflict in behavioral health care a lot, right?
Yeah.
We have patients not wanting to disclose things because that information can be used against them in ways that would harm them and does harm them. So, you know, there's a lot of gatekeeping of information to ourselves because it, you know, don't want to admit it. If I admit it, then she can document that and then that's on record. And, you know, like I just had all these like constant swirling thoughts of like, what am I going to do? And I thought my life was over.
Wow.
I didn't want to be admitted to I was having some trouble breathing. Sometimes high amounts of fentanyl can do not so great things with your lungs. Sometimes naloxone can also do not so great things to your lungs. In like high amounts, you can get like flash pulmonary edema or like pulmonary swelling and fluid collection.
Yeah.
And so they needed to admit me, and I just, you know, I didn't want to put my peers in that position.
Yeah.
I had people messaging me on Facebook. I didn't know who to trust. You know, people good-hearted, you know, saying like, hey, I heard the code paged overhead and I wondered what would, you know, because it was, you know, code blue, staff bathroom, 5th floor, tower ICU. Like, so people knew the location. They knew it was a staff bathroom, that it was likely to be an employee. And so a lot of talking goes on, you know, a lot of people, you want to find out more information. And so I didn't know who was really supportive and who was just trying to figure more out.
Yes.
And I didn't know who to trust. And
of course.
I also didn't want to like be in the hospital and just have to be like, she's in bed, blah, 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 you know?
Yes.
And so I was transferred to West Penn. That was a difficult experience. You know, my husband had come to the ER. He was very angry, as he rightfully, you know, had the right to be, because he was blindsided. You know, 3 a.m, get called into the emergency department, and your wife overdosed on fentanyl. You know, it was so much for him. And so they took me by ambulance to West Penn, admitted me, and I was discharged the next day after things were more stable. But they didn't give me anything. I didn't have, you know, and this is 2016, so peer work is just starting and things like that, certified recovery specialist. But I didn't, all they gave me was this packet, like generic discharge packet, right? That was, you know, here's your diagnosis. It prints out cookie cutter discharge instructions based on your diagnosis. You have a substance use disorder. Here's some couple numbers. No one came and sat and talked with me. And I honestly, it could have been like my own perception of it. Nurses get report, nurses talk. And I even experienced it in active addiction. You know, when I would have a patient with a substance use disorder, or someone, the other one, they're drug seeking and things like that. Like, I would hear the way that my peers would talk about people who were going through what I was doing.
Yeah.
And so I think that, you know, there's probably, they got report, the nurses are talking, the charge nurse has to know, yeah, I've got a nurse from Butler and she overdosed, you know. And because of that, because I do think that is real, because that did happen.
Of course,
the person who delivered my meal tray was nicer to me than my nurse, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like a really yucky feeling. And why I'm so big on like stigma and why it matters, because stigma does affect the care that patients receive.
Yes.
If you describe someone as an addict versus describing, or a substance abuser rather than a person with a substance use disorder, then those clinicians, and research shows this, those clinicians give lower quality care based off of those stigmatized perceptions.
Yep.
They might see the person as more of a throwaway, lacking the ability to recover. And so then we withhold resources and different things like that. We have to know that our words and the language we use, especially in the medical settings, especially, and like, this is not out here to be the language police. I will be the first person to say this is always a work in progress.
Yes.
You know, this started, you know, with the, you know, end the word, whatever the R word thing was, be the word, end the word, or something like that. But that's what it started for me in like working on my own language. And then I got into this field and realized like, oh, wow, I use some stigmatizing language that like maybe I don't need to be using. And so this isn't to rob people of that ability to self-identify as an addict, to self-identify as an alcoholic. Remember, self-identify.
Self-identify.
It's for that person to use.
Yes.
We don't label other people. And so same thing with like clean. If it helps you to identify as clean, great.
Yes.
I identify as in recovery and then explain what that means to me, because recovery and abstinence are different. Recovery is an entire process, right? And it's a journey, and I am still in that journey consistently. And so I have to be very specific in the way that I speak. And I do that because my goal is to shift general public perception of people who use drugs. Because if we're going to try to destigmatize people in recovery, we need to destigmatize drug use.
Yes.
Because, you know, like immediately, if that person returns to use, are they still just as stigmatized, or like, do they still have worth? You know, are they still human, deserving of love, care, and a life worth living?
And a chance.
A chance.
Well, you know,
and multiple chances.
Well, yes, because that's a huge theme during this season, especially with addiction, is that a lot of times it'll be looked as negative when someone's, oh, well, they've been in recovery 4 times. They've been in recovery. But the percentage of them actually succeeding, actually, you know.
Yeah. And also like thinking about how we measure success. What is success?
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Like, can we ask the patient, like, can we ask the client or the person we're trying to help what they want their goals to be? And
what is their goal?
Yeah.
Right?
Like help them make a SMART goal that is specific, measurable, achievable, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Help them to realize that and help them get there. Hold their hand, right? That's where meet people where they're at. And then, you know, oftentimes we'll hear that, but don't leave them there. Yeah, don't leave them there, but don't drag them where you want to drag them.
Yes.
Take their hand and help support them to climb the mountain that they want to climb.
Yeah.
At whatever pace they would like. Because then, even if they, you know, leave because they return to use or whatever, you're always going to be a trustworthy person for them to come back to. And we saw that a lot when I worked at one of the opioid use disorder centers of excellence. We did office-based addiction treatment, prescribing medications like buprenorphine and naltrexone, also known as Suboxone or Sublocade, also known, the naltrexone is also known as Vivitrol or Revia. And, you know, we would have patients who disappeared and we'd wonder where they went. You know, we'd think certain things and then they'd come back. That's the beautiful part. That's the beautiful part, because coming back is hard. And you see this in the rooms too, like 12-step meetings, right? Like to have the humility to come and say like, hey, like this is where I'm at. But like it takes a culture of trust to create that.
Yes.
It takes people to say like, hey, like your worth is still just as much as it was before. You didn't lose worth because of this. That you said about like the social connectedness, I really feel that like that is part of the solution.
This episode is brought to you by Butler County District Attorney Richard A. Goldinger, R.W. McDonald & Sons Incorporated, Robert Stevens Jewelers. Thank you to our sponsors for your support on our first season of the Alter Ego podcast. Be sure to click the link in bio for your discount for BetterHelp Therapy online. 10% off your first month. Thank you to Rachel Shuster for sitting down with me, sharing your story, but surprise, because there's more to come from Rachel. Tomorrow, I will be dropping a bonus part 2 of episode 3 on all streaming platforms. Rachel and I ended up talking for 2 hours, and I thought, why not break this up and keep things interesting here at Alter Ego? Thank you for tuning in to Alter Ego. Join me every Monday and Wednesday for new episodes. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and follow us on Instagram at Alter Ego Podcast. Until next time, stay safe, stay hopeful, stay kind.